Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, team, today. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have you with us on this Sunday. If this is your first time here, as Pastor John mentioned, or maybe it's your first time back in a long time, we just want to say a special welcome to you for being here today. My name's Rob. I'm one of the pastors, and we've been in a series talking about mending relationships. Have you ever been speaking to someone, and it occurs to you partway through the conversation that they are not listening to you? As a preacher, of course, I get to experience this every week, so it's kind of something I'm familiar with. There's a story about President Franklin Roosevelt, who is known for his big grin and his boisterous personality, being kind of welcoming and a big spirit. But even he, as president, discovered that there are people that oftentimes in long reception lines when he's visiting, they don't listen to what he's saying. So he decided to play a little trick on his guests one evening. There was an event at the White House. There was a long line of people lined up to greet him. And as people were coming by, he thought he'd do a little test to see how many people are actually listening to what he says. And so each person came up and he would extend his hand. He had a big welcoming grin on his face, and he said to them, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." People would automatically respond with, "How lovely. You're doing a great job. Keep up the good work, Mr. President." Except for one of the diplomats who was standing next to him in this receiving line, who after a little bit finally leaned over to him and quietly whispered, "I'm sure she had it coming." Well, we've all had this sinking feeling at one time or another that we are speaking and the other person is not listening. They're not receiving what we are saying. Maybe we're saying the words, but they're not getting the meaning. Maybe we're trying to express something really, really important and it's not being picked up in our communications. That there's something going on inside of us that we really want the other person to know. And maybe even as we've been talking about mending relationships, you've gotten up the great courage and bravery to kind of extend a word to somebody or reach out to somebody, and you don't really know if it's gotten through to them or not. Well, we've been in this series, which is really all about discipleship. That we have received Jesus Christ as Lord of our life. And that as we have received Christ as Lord, now begins the lifelong work of the Holy Spirit refining us and transforming us from the inside out. And that discipleship is not just about behavior modification. It's not just about kind of putting on this outer action, but it's an inside change, a transformation that happens here and gets lived out in the way that we treat other people. In particular, how well we are able to love other people. And we've called this series Mending, and using the image from the New Testament of fishing nets. Oftentimes people would go out and they would be fishing, and just the wear and tear and use of nets, they required mending. They required to be fixed. Holes would form on them, and if they didn't fix them, the nets would no longer work as they tried to catch fish. And the same is true in relationships, that just as we live life, the wear and tear of everyday life, there can be holes, there can be problems that begin, there can be a distance that begins, and as Christians who want to love other people well, we have to pay attention to these and work on these. And we've talked about that during the last 2 years of this pandemic. That's put a lot of extra strain and challenge on relationships. And some of you have people in your life right now that because of circumstances, because of events, you just aren't maybe as close as you used to be, that there's been some conflict that has arisen, or maybe the relationship has completely had a break, or there's been some reason that you're not even talking to each other. And I joked a few weeks ago that, given all the extra challenges and barriers to relationships in this season, it really is almost a miracle that any of us have any friends left or have any communication at all with people. But the challenge of this series is that it's not about trying to get other people to do things. We've not been talking about how to change other people. The only person that we can change is ourselves. So we look inward. We pay attention to what's going on in our hearts, beneath the surface of our lives. We're not trying to get our employees to do something better or somebody in our family to do something different. This is where we say, God, I give you permission to do the work that you need to do, so that I can love others with your love. Now, last week, we talked a little bit about that our emotional maturity and our spiritual maturity are connected. And that maybe you hadn't thought about that before, but it makes sense as we think about it. If you've met somebody who's been a Christian for 30 years, and they are angry every time someone disagrees with them and they have an outburst, they're mean to people, they always assume the worst about you, their insecurities have poisoned all of their relationships, they really have no friends left because they've all fallen apart, and they feel like they need to be the center of attention or always get the credit for everything, you would not look to that person and say, boy, that's a spiritual giant, or that is a spiritually mature person. We wouldn't think that. We would say, look, if you've learned to be angry and not sin, if you're able to deal with the stuff that's going on in your life so that it doesn't poison all of the relationships in your life, if you can serve silently and let someone else get the credit, we would say that is a sign of spiritual and emotional maturity. And so we're learning, all of us, to pay attention to the work that God is trying to do in our life beneath the surface. And today, the skill that we're going to look at as we think about mending relationships, and as you think about the relationships in your life that might be strained or might need some tender, loving care, is like oxygen to that relationship. If it's just kind of hanging on, if it's kind of feeling suffocated or distanced, the skill that we're going to talk about today will breathe some life into it as you work on the repairing part. And it's found in the book of James. Now, James was the brother of Jesus. Think about that for a second. And what is so fascinating is that when Jesus went off and started his ministry, James was not a believer. He did not believe his own brother's claims to be the Son of God. In fact, there's a scene in the Gospels where Jesus is off teaching and preaching, and James and his mom and some of his siblings, they go and find him and try to get him to come home. They're worried about him. He's saying crazy things like he's the Son of God. And so they go out and they kind of say, look, come home. We'll get you some counseling. We'll get some things sorted out. It'll be okay. But you're embarrassing us. You're embarrassing yourself. He was not a believer. But then Jesus was tried. He was crucified. And he was resurrected. And James met the resurrected Jesus, his brother. And he believed. And he had transforming faith. He became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He was martyred for his faith that his own brother was the Son of God. And he earned this nickname of being James the Just. And now he's pastoring the church in Jerusalem, which is the heart of the Christian world. And his church is filled with people who are in conflict with each other. There's rich people and poor people, and they're in conflict. There's people of different ethnicities, and they're in conflict. And he's trying to lead them well. And so he's giving them advice and counsel on how to do that. And we find it today in James chapter 1. I'll invite you to turn there. You can use the Bible in the seat in front of you if you'd like to follow along. It's on page 1881, or you can look it up digitally as well. James chapter 1, and I'm just going to read verses 19 through to 21. Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For our anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. As you and I think about mending relationships in our life, the skill today that I want us to be thinking about as disciples who are following Jesus seriously is that we would be slow to speak and quick to listen. Now, maybe an image will be helpful for you today, because the word that James uses here to describe being quick to listen is also used by John in John's gospel. So it's kind of comical to me, but John writes an account of the resurrection of Jesus, and in that account of the resurrection, he talks about the fact that the women discovered Jesus was no longer in the tomb. They ran back, and when they got the news, Peter and John ran to see the tomb. And John likes us to let us know that he got there first. He was quickest to the tomb. It wasn't a race, but hey, if you're just wanting to know the details about the event, John says, I beat Peter on the way to the tomb. And this is kind of the same word. He got there first. In other words, let your ears get there before your mouth gets there. In fact, he uses the language slow to speak, which we should hear as late to speak, late to arriving. So picture this for a second. Picture a racetrack. There's a starting line, there's a finishing line. You've got an ear, and you've got a mouth. James is saying this: let your ears win the race, and let your mouth show up late for the race. And as you and I think about relationships that we are working on at this moment, this skill of being slow to speak and quick to listen can breathe oxygen back into that relationship. Now, as we talk about that, even as we think about it here for a few minutes this morning, that makes sense to us. Like, no one's thinking, no, I think I should speak first, I should never listen. No one's probably going to say that. We all agree that listening is such a life-giving thing in the context of a relationship. The challenge is, it's really, really hard. Let me share a quote with you this morning. I love this quote. Talking is like drinking a great Cabernet. And that Cabernet is a really fancy fruit juice. Listening is like doing squats. Talking is like eating a cinnamon bun. You can picture a cinnamon bun fresh out of the oven, dripping with icing. Listening is like reading a corporate report. Does that resonate with you? That given the option, maybe you would rather speak in a conversation than really do the heavy lifting of listening, because you know what they need to do. You know what they did was wrong. You know the things that they should be doing that would fix this situation, right? You know their flaws and their thinking and all that's been going on that would really make a big difference. If they would just listen to you, then everything would be better. I mean, I can literally picture myself, because I'm not always a great listener, sitting talking to someone, and I'm letting them speak. They're saying their part, but on the inside, I'm like an engine that's just revving. And I'm revving the gas pedal, just waiting for them to either finish speaking or to leave a little bit of a pause. And as soon as they leave a pause, I am going in. And I've got a boatload of words and ideas and things and advice and counsel, and I'm just going to run them right over with everything that I want to say to them. For James, as he's thinking about this group of disciples in his church, listening, his counsel to listen is not about being courteous. It's not about just being polite or waiting your turn. It's about learning to understand. That listening must lead to understanding. I love this Proverbs 18, verse 2. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. And I love this idea of finding pleasure in understanding. That as we listen to people, that as we are in conversations with people, we approach it with a sense that I've got something to learn here. There's something that they can teach me about this situation, about what's going on in their life. There are some insights that I can gain, that I can learn from some things from them in this moment. That there's an eagerness as we listen to people that I can learn something with humility. Now, as we're listening, we might even also say, look, we may ask a question. Look, as I'm listening to you and I hear you speak, I want to hear more about that. Could you help me understand? Maybe tell me a little bit more about what you're saying. And teenagers here today, if you want to completely shock your mother, let me give you this advice. Next time she's speaking to you or telling you something, I want you to stop. And then I want you to say, look, Mom, what you're saying is really important to me. I really want to hear what it is you have to say. So is there another way that you could say that for me? Because I really want to hear what's on your mind right now. And then you can call 911 because she will probably have collapsed. Slow to speak, quick to listen. Now, this is hard for us as Christians because, just think about our culture. I saw a funny comment the other day that said, if you want to learn how to communicate really well with other humans, go on social media, watch how people are talking to each other, and do the exact opposite. Do the exact opposite. We've had so many moments and opportunities where complex and important issues have been discussed and where we've been able to take stands on, whether it's masks, vaccines, government mandates. Now we're talking about abortion. Everybody has an opinion, but virtually no one is interested in listening to understand what the other person is actually saying. The goal is not learning. The goal is not understanding. The goal is to be right and to confirm my rightness. Can you imagine if someone said this to you? They said, look, I hear what you're saying. I'm struggling to understand your position. Could you please say a little bit more? And if you don't mind, I'm going to take some notes about what you're saying. And I'm going to write them down, and I'm going to go home tonight and think about them a little bit further, because what we're talking about is so important. I want to truly hear you and understand. And if we're willing to be honest and a little bit uncomfortable as Christians, isn't this kind of the stereotype of Christians, that we aren't really great at listening to other people, and sometimes we're just more concerned with being right? James says, slow to speak, quick to listen. And I know some of you would push back and say, hey, look, with all due respect, sometimes what other people are saying isn't true. It's not biblical. I don't agree with it. It might not even be wise or safe. So don't I have some responsibility to say something? And of course we do. That's what a conversation is all about. But by being quick to listen, or listening first and not even telling our mouth where the meeting is so it shows up late, we'll be better prepared to speak, to respond with greater grace and effectiveness, because we'll have greater understanding about what's really going on in the situation. Because we've listened first, and now we can speak more articulately and more clearly to the issue. And I think for James, and as I think about my own experience of learning in this area, after we have listened and there's been a growing understanding of what's really going on, it doesn't always change my position, but it changes the posture of my heart towards the other person. Maybe not change my view on the issue. We may agree to disagree, but after listening and understanding, it almost always changes the posture of my heart to the other person, in the sense that I have greater grace, understanding, mercy, and patience for what's going on. I love this quote. It's a quote actually from the world of education from Robert Frost. Education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or self-confidence. I think it's a great goal for you and I to aspire to as disciples. That as we sit with people and listen, and maybe listen to people who feel very differently about things than we do, that we can hear them out. And as mature Christians, we can disagree with them without losing our temper, losing our mind, losing our cool. And as we listen, our position might change, but our posture of our hearts towards them, it grows in our capacity to express the love of God. And that would be a win. Let's keep looking here just at James for a second. I want to look at verse 20 and then 21. For man's anger, or human's anger, does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. And this is the biggest no-brainer. I freak out, I get mad, I slam a few cupboard doors, I tell somebody off at work, I write a nasty email to my brother, I yell at my kids, and surprisingly, nobody grows in their faith. Shocking. Their righteousness does not grow because I got mad at them, James says. But then he says this in verse 21. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly, this has been a word we keep coming back to in this series, humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Now, James is so brilliant. He's writing to these Christians who are in conflict. Their relationships are being pulled apart, and he wants them to see that listening and understanding is the work of discipleship. And he reminds them how faith works. God speaks, we listen, we rid our lives of things that draw us away from the Lord, we accept the Lord's word, and we experience his life or his salvation. Some of you know this. You were going through life, and God spoke to you somehow. You listened. And as his word took root in your life, you responded in faith. You turned from your old way and you embraced his way. And you became a person of faith. And you had salvation as the result of it. And this should not just be a one-time experience, but as Christians, again and again, God speaks to us. We hear him. We listen. And then we respond in some appropriate way to the word in our life. And there's salvation, there's freedom, there's joy, there's peace. We get the benefit of it. This is the very muscle of discipleship. God speaks, we listen, we respond, and then we get the benefit of it. God speaks, we listen, we respond, we get the benefit of it. This is the very basics of discipleship. But James is saying to us, imagine this. In conversations with people that we are working on, they speak. We listen. And then maybe we need to respond because maybe we didn't understand the situation. Maybe we assumed some things that actually aren't true. Maybe we thought it was all about this and it's really all about that. So now we can respond appropriately. And there will be salvation, not eternal salvation, but saving from regret, saving from saying things that were based on assumptions that are not true, saving the hurt of somebody that we might direct towards someone else, and maybe even saving the relationship that hangs in the balance. So as you think about relationships in your life that maybe need some work, maybe need some attention, maybe need some help, let's our sole agenda be to create an opportunity to hear that person out. Create space where you show up with your ears and you don't even tell your mouth where the meeting is so it shows up really late, and you just listen with the goal of trying to better understand the person and what's going on in their life. And I've actually prepared, and you will not like this, I prepared a little listening test. So if you think, oh, I'm a really good listener, at the Welcome Center, there's a little test that will help you get a sense of how well you actually listen so that we can continue to grow in this area. And to approach with humility and really understand what's going on in the life of other people. I love this quote, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. And we can give that gift to somebody, to the people in our family that we love, for our friends and coworkers, for people that are in our neighborhood that are really meaningful to us. We can give them this gift by learning this skill that James is teaching. Now, as we close this morning, I want to turn it a little bit, because I know that every week when we gather here together, that we bring with us stuff that's going on beneath the surface of our lives. And the Lord has got a standing invitation to all of us that we can meet with Him. And we can pour out our hearts to Him, and He listens to us. He's a great listener. And that even today, as you're processing this and what this might look like, the Lord invites us to come into His presence and talk to Him about the things that we're feeling that are going on in our lives. And He promises to listen to us. And so today, let me just pray for us as we continue to look for ways to love people well. God, we thank You so much that You, as the creator of the universe, You create space for us to come and to pour out our hearts to You. That You see all that's going on right now in our lives, the complexities, the uncertainties, the joys, the adventures. And that, Lord, today we can bring it all to You in prayer. Knowing, God, that You don't just listen, but You hear. That You understand. And that we can trust You as You give us direction. Lord, I pray for a spirit of courage to overcome all of us, a spirit of bravery as we want to continue to grow as Your followers in this way. And Lord, that we would give the gift of listening well to the people around us, and that we look forward to the fruits it will bring in our lives. Amen.